Hi, tonight's topic is relating to history. Of course, this period of year, we're immersed consciously in reflecting on historical events, more so than perhaps other periods of the year. And I'd like to start with some general observations and then try to apply them to what we're preoccupied with at this particular time. First of all, as everybody knows, if you're ignorant of history, you're condemned to repeat it. That's been repeated, if you're ignorant of that, you're going to hear it 1,000 times again. But I think what people don't appreciate is that there are two different ways of being ignorant of history. One is to not know what happened. The other is to not understand what happened. And studying history books and learning about the events of history only solves the first problem. It doesn't automatically solve the second problem, and sometimes is damaging because it creates misimpression as to what the historical events mean. When Mordechai goes wailing through the streets and Esther is unaware of why he's doing that, she sends a message to him with two questions. Mazeh ve'al mazeh. Literally in Hebrew, what is this and why is this? What is it for? What does it mean? What is its significance? What is its implications? She wants to know both. If you don't know what's happening on the ground, any general themes of principles and movements and so forth and so on will have no practical application because you have to know what you're confronting. Mordechai is wailing through the streets because there's a terrible danger to the Jewish people. But on the other hand, you could know all the concrete events and not understand the reason behind it, and not understand the organizing principle behind it. So she asks Mordechai both questions. The study of history as just the raw recital of events, which doesn't exist because whenever you write about anything, you're automatically interpreting it in various ways. But if you make the interpretation a minimum, then you may be missing the point of the events. So in order to prevent yourself from repeating the same historical mistakes, you need to investigate at least those two dimensions. Maybe there's much more you have to do, but you have to investigate both of those dimensions. There are various contemporary movements whose purpose is to save Judaism from extinction. For decades, in the United States anyway, the slogan of left of center Jewish identity movements was continuity, Jewish continuity. Notice that continuity is a profoundly pessimistic goal. Let's just not lose any more. No hope of improving things, making a revolution, bringing more people on board. Let's just not lose continuity. And the means that they chose to use have been shown historically ineffective for thousands of years. And they haven't learned that lesson. They may know about Jewish idol worshippers in the First Temple period, and they may know about Jewish Hellenists in the Second Temple period, and they may know about the Sadducees and the Baitusis and the rest who denied the oral tradition at the end of the Second Temple period, and they may know about the Karaites who have just about died out, and the Marranos who, in terms of their underground Jewish identity, have just about died out. They may know about all of that, but they haven't drawn the correct conclusion that what survives is a particular formula of Jewish belief and Jewish practice. So they're pouring more money into Jewish for Jewish youth, trips to the opera and horseback riding outings, and dances on Yom Kippur and so forth and so on, and not realizing that they're repeating thousands of years of mistakes, which have led to the total loss of such reformist type movements, and will do so again. That's not where the secret lies. So that's one thing. We want to relate to history in terms of the content of the historical events and what their meaning implies. Second of all, there's at least two different ways of relating to history. And, I'm sorry, let me back up one. There are two remarks I want to make on the basis of the Haggadah. First of all, past historical events can play a role in your present reality in different ways. The Haggadah, says the Gemara, is supposed to go from degraded state of the Jewish people to their successful state. There's a Talmudic dispute as to exactly what that transition is, from what beginning point to what end point. One says the beginning point is slavery and the end point is freedom. The other says the beginning point is our ancestors of idol worshippers, back to Abraham's father, and up to the receipt of the Torah at Sinai. Now, the Haggadah commemorates an event in which we got our freedom from the Egyptians. So there's no question that you have to tell the story of slavery to freedom. The second opinion says that's not enough. You have to tell more of the story. Go back to historical precursors and go forward to historical consequences. Now, if you tell me, well, look, the more context you have, the better you understand the events in question, I think I would agree to that. The more context you have, the more perspective you have on the events in question. But where do you draw the line? Why not go back to the flood and Noah? Why not go forward to the conquest and entry and settling of the land of Israel? Why not go back to the creation and go forward to the Messiah? Who told you to draw the line here and say, this is the extra context we need and the other we don't need? The answer is that the context that the second opinion is suggesting is not just that the more the better, the more the merrier, but without understanding that the transition from slavery to freedom was part of a transition from idol worship to receiving the Torah, you don't understand the transition from slavery to freedom at all. It's not just added context for more depth. The second opinion says, without understanding that it is the internal portion of moving from idol worship to serving God, you don't understand slavery to freedom at all. And if you think of slavery to freedom on a Greek model or a Roman model or a contemporary Western model, you're not getting it. That's not what it was at all. It's a total mistake. Not just needing more background. So when you think about the past, there are two types of influences that learning something about the past can have. One can increase the depth of your understanding of what you're facing, what you're dealing with, which is valuable. And the other is learning information from the past without which you will completely misunderstand what's happening. There are contemporary critiques of Torah Judaism. I've been talking about some of them at my 6:30 shir in the last couple of weeks. Some people's attitude towards critique is, let's be open-minded. Let's not be overly self-confident. Maybe we are making mistakes. Let's deal with each question in its own terms. Let's deal with it and see whether it has something to teach us. Maybe we do have to change our self-perception or our expression in some way. It sounds so high-minded and noble and appropriately self-doubting that sounds very virtuous. If you think of thousands of years of critique of traditional Judaism, in every historical period, the vast majority of people in the non-Jewish world, for sure, and sometimes including the Jewish world, were completely confident that traditional Judaism is not the answer. Maybe part of the answer, some parts of it may be relevant, but other parts not. And you see that the critiques change in tremendously fundamental ways, but they all have one thing in common. Judaism is wrong, that's for sure. Judaism is wrong. You may begin to feel that there's a certain animus built into the non-Jewish world that one of its principles is to be anti-Jewish. That's where it's coming from. And they'll make use of whatever is contemporary, whether it's polytheism in the First Temple period, the whole of the Near East was polytheistic. You guys just haven't got it right. One invisible God? Give it up, that's stupid. You know? You tell me he's invisible? That's just a phony way of saying there isn't anything there. You just made it up. This is the kind of critique. You're invisible God? Well, the Babylonians said, well, we won the war, didn't we? We burned down your temple, didn't we? So surely you've got to recognize that our God is more powerful than your God. We won the war! And we say no. So we say, you're just hopeless. You're just hopeless. Not willing to admit your faults, not willing to recognize other people have a piece of the truth. All the babble that you hear from the critics. If you take a look, you have to have a 3,000-year-old perspective on critique of Judaism, wow, it begins to give you a sense that wherever you'll be and whatever they believe, they're going to be against us. That makes it hard to take them seriously when they use whatever they happen to have, throw at us, no matter what it is. At that point, you become you feel much less reason to be so open-minded and conciliatory and consider the possibility that you could learn something that would change your mind and modify your beliefs and practice and so on and so on. It's the latest, they'll find something else. So I think that's one example of how knowing some history can give you a perspective that helps you understand. If you understand where it's coming from, then you know how to interpret its seriousness. And in this case, I think it's worthwhile to reduce your perception of its seriousness to a great extent. So that's one thing. There are two different types of material, some of which give you perspective and some of which protect you from really misunderstanding what you're undergoing. And then, God says in the middle, every Jew has to regard himself as though he left Egypt. It doesn't say that about other things in Jewish history. Nowhere does it say that you have to regard yourself as if you stood and saw the sea split, or you ate manna in the wilderness, or you participated in conquering the land of Israel, or you built the temple in Jerusalem. It doesn't say that. It says you have to see yourself as participating in the Exodus. That means some historical events, the Torah tradition tells us, have to be relived in what we're doing. Others don't have to be relived in that way. They have to be known as past context, and they have to give us some perspective, but they don't have to actually be relived. This actually has a reflection on halacha, as Rabbi Meiselman taught me, it's said in the Rambam. It's too complicated to go into right now, but there is that context. So, for example, we say that the Passover Seder, a person should think, we're leaving Egypt. The word for Egypt in Hebrew is Mitzrayim. A Meitzar is a wall that binds you in, and the description of Egypt was, no one gets out. No one. No slave ever is freed. No slave ever escapes from Egypt. It never happens. Which means the boundaries that you're facing are absolute, they're uncrossable, and the best you can do is make your peace with them. And then the shock takes place that although, in general, that rule is true, for the Jewish people it wasn't true. The walls collapsed, and they did escape. And the Jew has to say to himself, where are my boundaries? Where are my walls? Where am I fenced in? Where am I inclined to give up and say, no, that's not possible. I taught university in the 70s, ancient history. And towards the end, when I would talk to students, especially graduate students, what are your hopes? What are you looking forward to? I would often hear, well, my father did X, Y, Z. I could never do that. I could never do what my father did. So I'm hoping for this, and this, and this. And I said to them, if your father did it, why do you think you couldn't do it? This guy's 21 or 23. He has a life expectancy of 82. He could never do it. His horizons are shut, closed. Never do it? How could you know at 23 what you could do at 45? You have no clue what you could do at 45. You have no clue what will happen to you between then and now. And I tried to convince them that it was wrong to have shut down their perspectives. I wasn't always successful. Their fathers did it, but you should meet my father. I mean, he's really special. He's tough, and he's smart, and he could do those things, but I couldn't do those things. These people were hemmed in by these false walls. So what the Haggadah is telling us is we have to relive the Exodus from Egypt. 80% of the Jews in Egypt died there in the 3 days of darkness. Not everybody rose to this occasion to be able to see that the walls can fall, that the walls are artificial, that with God running history, really, as the Chazon Ish says, there's a big question mark about the future. You can't pin down what the future will be. So that's where we're really required to relive the events. This is a biblical commandment to relive those events, re-experience them. The Baal Shem Tov taught us that, although there isn't such a commandment of that type, but what we read about in Jewish history are archetypes of things that occur in miniature. You read about Moses, you think, wow, Moses. There's a little bit of Moses in every Jew. There are times when an enormous challenge arises, often totally unexpectedly, and you surprise yourself. But the child fell overboard and is drowning! And to your own shock, you jump overboard and you save him. You don't think about it, don't plan it, and you look back and you say, I did that? I didn't know I could do that. I didn't know I would do that. You learn something about yourself. It's a little bit, Moses is at the burning bush, and God says to rescue the Jewish people, and he has 1,000 objections. And then he goes and does it. That's Moses. What about Pharaoh? Yes, at the Baal Shem Tov, there's a little bit of Pharaoh in each of us, rationalizing, not wanting to give up on a pet project, which if I would take the time, we had a boy here, was here for a few weeks, and then he left. Why he left? Why are you leaving? Because if I stay here much longer, I might have to change my lifestyle. And I'm not staying. I'm getting out of here. He's right. He's right. He was raising arguments and hearing things, and he couldn't answer the evidence that we're presenting and the ideas that we're presenting, and he sort of felt that it's too dangerous to stay here. That's right. That's the Pharaoh in you speaking. Right? You can't relate to something which undermines a large part of your worldview with the thought that if I get on the right track, I'll have a much better life. So it's not as if these things are dead to us because there isn't a strict biblical commandment to relive them. It's just that it's much more miniature. It's impulses. It's competing elements of your psychology in yourself and in others, by the way. You can sometimes recognize these things in others. And again, looking back to history and seeing the paradigms where this took place and reading them for information about how life develops, what kind of principles there are, can add important perspective to what you're experiencing. Okay, this is general background about connecting to history or reflecting on history. I want to talk a little bit about if the Mashiach doesn't come in the next 3 days, we're going to have a fast on Yom Chamishi and commemorate the destruction of the temple. From time to time, a student asks, Rabbi, are you worried about the continued existence of the Jewish people? And I say, absolutely not. For two reasons. First of all, the Torah says that we are an eternal people, we're not going to disappear. And second of all, the closest thing in all of history to a controlled experiment is Jewish history. We have survived under every conceivable circumstance, positive, negative, support, destruction, opposition, infiltration, seduction of different types of cultures, and we have survived them all, and the vast majority we have survived without any naturalistic explanation why we survived. See the chapter of my book. And that being the case, if anything, of 3,000 plus years of Jewish history teaches us, is we're not going to disappear. I'm scared by the fact that this individual Jew is not going to make it. He or she is going to be lost. They're not going to contribute. They're not going to benefit from. They're not going to be part of the main project in the history of the universe. That's what motivates me and bothers me. But that the Jewish people is going to disappear, I don't think that's a reasonable worry for the two grounds that I mentioned. I was at a student convention, Jewish student convention in Chicago 30 years ago, and there was a fellow there who spoke. He said, we have to be very grateful for the migration of millions of Jews from Europe to America, starting around 1870 up to the 1930s, because since the Holocaust wiped out almost all of European Jewry, without that migration, then they would have been wiped out, and the whole of it would have been wiped out. So we have to be very thankful for the migration. Well, actually, in that observation, there's a common logical confusion. The fact that A causes B doesn't necessarily mean that A is necessary for B. A produces B, but it doesn't follow that without A you couldn't have B. Here's an example. A person's in an automobile crash, is brought to the emergency room. He's dying. And the doctor in the emergency room saves his life. And when he comes to express his gratitude, he says to him, Doc, you saved my life. Without you, I'd have been dead. And the doctor says, no, without me, the other doctor would have saved you. Oh, the fact that this doctor saved him doesn't mean that without that doctor, he wouldn't have lived. He could have lived through another doctor. So, the fact that the Jewish migration produced a remnant that wasn't hit by the Holocaust, because America wasn't conquered, doesn't mean that had they stayed there, they would have been destroyed. That doesn't follow. It doesn't follow for two big reasons. One a naturalistic reason and the other a theological reason. When you study history, you can divide the study of history into at least three different dimensions. One dimension is what happened. There's large-scale agreement about what happened, though not total agreement, because how to describe what happened, just what happened, does sometimes cause debate. A second dimension, which is much harder, is what caused what? What caused the French Revolution in 1879? Or the American Revolution? What caused the reinstitution of the monarchy after liberté, égalité, and fraternité in France? And why didn't it happen in America? What caused the fact that it happened in France didn't happen in America? That's much more controversial, much more subtle. That's dimension two. Dimension three, which is much, much worse, is to contemplate what's called the counterfactual. What really happened in history is ABC. If A hadn't happened, what would have happened after that? Now you're talking about a fantasy world. In the real world, A, B, and C happened. But you're asking, if A hadn't happened, would B and C have happened? Would they happen the same way? Would they happen a different way? That's two steps removed from the facts of history. That's very, very difficult to answer. Indeed, when you ask a counterfactual like that, usually the way you answer it is by knowing the laws that govern the phenomenon. I had a bag of sugar in my closet. My closet burned up and the sugar burned. If I had put a teaspoon of that sugar into my coffee, what would have happened? I didn't. It's burned up. I can't try it now. Yeah, but look, we know what sugar does. We know why it does it. The water causes the dissociation of the molecules and all the rest of it, right? So to say in history, if A hadn't happened, what would have happened, you have to know the laws of history. Really? You really think you know the laws of history? Like you know the laws of chemistry? Really? I hope you don't think that, because you're dead wrong if you do. So one reason why this teacher was wrong is because he's making that judgment. If there had not been a migration from Europe to America, then those Jews would have been killed in the Holocaust. Very hard to say, number one. But number two, he presents himself, this speaker, as a religious person. Who's running history after all? Are you a deist and think that God went on vacation and the world's running itself? Not if you're a Jewish believer. There's divine providence in history. Maybe if those Jews had stayed in Europe, then the total loss wouldn't have been tolerated and Hitler wouldn't have conquered Poland. He didn't have to conquer Poland. He failed in conquering Russia. Maybe he failed in conquering Poland. Or something else would have happened. Some of the revolutions who tried to assassinate him would have been successful. So you can't look at history that way from our point of view. And therefore, if somebody says to me why I'm not worried about the survival of the Jewish people, there's a bottleneck and the majority of Jews aren't religious. That has happened before. First of all, when the Assyrians took off the northern kingdom, that was 10 out of 12 tribes. At least temporarily they were lost. Some say that some of them were brought back. Some say not, but they were certainly, the Jewish population was desperately bad. Then there were Jewish idol worshippers in the first temple, and the Hellenists in the second temple, as I told you. So we've bled population in the past, and somehow Judaism has survived through all of that. But individual Jews being lost, and the quality of Jewish life being attenuated, that's something that we have seen, and that's something which we have to take as a challenge, knowing that certain things have been lost. For example, to use what I hope is an uncontroversial example, we do not have in our educational system the educational program that the Talmud dictates. We're just not following what the Talmud says. Ben Chamish leMikra, Ben Esther leMishnah, Ben Chamesh leGemara. From 5 to 10, study only the Holy Bible. From 10 to 15, study only the Mishnah. At 15, start Talmud. I don't think there's any school in the whole world that follows that program. There are reasons. Our circumstances are different. Our challenges are different. The vast majority, until very recently, have lived in the non-Jewish world, and we had social, political, economic, and religious pressures that we had to respond to. Right. I'm not questioning the decisions, but the decisions mean we're using a broken system because we live in a broken world. We're not using the ideal system. The ideal system is the Talmudic system. So we know we've taken losses, which motivates certain programs which are trying to recover the original Talmud, like the Zilberman group in the Old City. We're trying to recover it. So far, it hasn't caught on to the vast majority of the Jewish educational world. And again, I'm not saying who's right and who's wrong. I'm not saying what should be done. You have to recognize if you're not following what the Talmud said, that means you're pleading that you're special circumstances which require you to do otherwise. Okay? So we have to realize that we're living in that kind of broken circumstance, and when we regard our own circumstances and what we can do to make the best out of our own opportunities. Now, the temple, people associate the temple with sacrifices. That's not wrong, but it's very, very short-sighted. Very short-sighted. The Talmud was much, much more than just a place of sacrifices. So, for example, you know that the rabbis at the beginning of the Second Temple set up a correspondence between institutionalized prayer and the sacrifices. The number of prayers, the time of the prayers, something about the way in which prayers are expressed, is parallel to the sacrifices in the temple. Why did they do that? How did they do that? What was motivating them? And here you will hear people say, well, there were no sacrifices, we had to do something. So this is a way of sort of keeping Jewish spirituality, Jewish continuity by creating a substitute. That's dead wrong. Because the people who instituted prayer are the people who lived at the beginning of the Second Temple, when there were sacrifices. Excuse me, hello. And the Talmud, when it records that set of body of rabbinic institution, uses the phrase "Tfilos kineged korbanos tiknu." The rabbis ordained the prayers corresponding to the sacrifices, not in place of, but corresponding to. So why did they do that? Where did they get the idea from? Well, actually, there are explicit verses that talk about it before the structure of the temple, the loss of the sacrifices. There's a very famous verse in Isaiah, which is famous because it became a song. I shall bring them to my holy mountain, and I shall cause them to rejoice in my house of prayer. Note that. I shall cause them to rejoice in my house of prayer. Their sacrifices shall be accepted willingly upon the altar, for my house shall be a house of prayer for all peoples. Golly. It starts with house of prayer, it ends with house of prayer, and in the middle you have the sacrifices. What's going on? What's the title of the place where the sacrifices is offered? Title is House of Prayer. Is that a bit surprising? Could it indicate possibly that there was an association between the temple and prayer predating the Babylonian exile? Well, let's go much further back. King Solomon built a temple, and when it was finished, he gave a dedication, several chapters in the beginning of the first book of Kings. In that dedication, he prays to God that the temple should stand and be successful, and it should serve its purpose. The only purpose King Solomon mentions is prayer. He doesn't even hint that there are sacrifices there. If all you had was King Solomon's prayer, you'd think it was a synagogue. Isn't that a little strange? Well, at the very least, what you learn is that sacrifices and prayer are intimately entwined with one another. The very concept of sacrifice and prayer are it's like two sides of a coin. They're back to back with one another. They're entwined with one another. So then, that means that the temple not only was a place where sacrifices were offered, but also was essential to prayer. The way some of the commentators put it, using modern terminology, is let's suppose you're standing in Tzfas in the north, or in Paris, or in New York, and you pray. Your prayer goes around on a great circle to Jerusalem. That's the shortest way, and from there it goes up. From there it goes up to heaven. It doesn't go from New York straight up. The connection between the earth and heaven, which carries prayer, is in Jerusalem. It's in the temple. So with the temple gone, our prayers are fractured. That's why in every prayer we pray for the rebuilding of the temple. Every one. Even on Shabbos. Also, at the end of the prayer, is that because without the temple, the prayers are fractured. Okay. What about Torah? What about Torah? Very strange. Every time you finish a prayer, you say Yiratzon. The temple should be rebuilt and give us our portion in Torah. Really. Temple should be rebuilt and give us our portion in Torah. And the sacrifice should be pleasing to you as in former generations, and so on and so on. What's that doing in there? Give us our portion in Torah. The whole paragraph is about rebuilding the temple and reinstituting the sacrifices, except that in the middle it says, give us our portion in Torah. What's that doing there? Well, here's a little bit. The Gemara says this and more. Here's a little bit. The Sanhedrin. Where was the meeting place of the Sanhedrin? It was in a portion of the temple called the Lishkas Hagozis, and you had a wall around the closest part of the temple, the wall that before the Kodesh, and the wall. The wall looked like this. So this is the Kodesh, the holy part of the temple. Not the Holy of Holies, but the holy part. This is the wall. And this is where the Sanhedrin sits. So that the periphery of the holy goes like this. Half is within the periphery, and half is out the periphery. And that's where they sat. Okay, Rabbi, that's where they sat. Maybe real estate was cheap there. Not exactly in the Holy Temple. And there was a rule. The legal rule is this. Oh, I almost, thank you. I'll lose this. Yeah. Is it okay? Yeah, it's okay. And the rule is this. As long as that is the headquarters of the Sanhedrin, then courts everywhere in the world could try capital cases. The Sanhedrin was exiled from there. It was exiled to 10 different places before it disbanded entirely. As soon as the Sanhedrin moved from there, I don't mean that we were there 24/7, obviously, that was their headquarters. The minute they lost possession of that particular headquarters, no capital case could be tried anywhere in the world. Why? The metaphysical reason is because sitting there, Sanhedrin is the highest institution of Jewish scholarship in the world, and it's right there in the Holy Temple. So then there's a flow from above which affects our ability to understand Torah, teach Torah, communicate Torah, and apply Torah. And if that flow is interrupted, we can't take the confidence to try a capital case. We can't take responsibility for trying a case that could end with execution. So, the temple is also a place where the flow of Torah is supported. So in addition to offering animal sacrifices, which is another subject I'm not going to go into tonight, you have both prayer and Torah being supported by the temple. Now, if you think about it, there's a certain logic here. I can't remember if I mentioned to you or I mentioned at 6 o'clock, but there's a Gemara that says certain types of suffering that people undergo are because God loves the person and wants to do something for him that's very necessary, very important. Out of God's kindness, he cleanses his failures or gives him extra reward or does something out of kindness. And the Gemara asks, is that true for all suffering? Could all suffering be like that? Are there types of suffering which wouldn't be characterized as coming just out of God's kindness? The Gemara says yes. There are two types of suffering which would not be characterized as coming from God's kindness. One is one that interrupts Torah study, makes Torah study impossible. And the other would be suffering that makes prayer impossible. Well, okay, now let's think about that ourselves. Torah study, you must have already, living in this yeshiva, have heard a dozen drushes telling you how important Torah study is. It's fundamental, it counts up as much as all the other mitzvahs. There's lots of literature on that. Okay, I hear that. if there's suffering that comes upon a person that makes it impossible to study Torah, that wouldn't be just out of God's kindness. But prayer, according to, I guess, all the medieval authorities except for the Rambam, prayer is not a biblical commandment at all. It's only rabbinic. Gee, if I were looking for a second candidate of suffering that's not strictly out of God's kindness, I would say suffering that makes it impossible to keep Shabbos, or suffering that makes it impossible to keep kashrus, because when you eat treif things, it sullies your soul in certain ways, or suffering that makes it impossible to give charity, or who knows what. Why would you pick prayer as the other one, which would be so severe a disruption, it wouldn't be an expression of God's kindness? And the answer, I think this is the only correct answer, maybe I'm wrong, is that prayer and Talmud Torah, the study of Torah, are two halves of a dialogue with the Kodesh Baruch Hu. In prayer, we're talking to Him, and in studying Torah, He's talking to us. One symptom of this is that if you are a person who's Torah baso manoso, whose Torah is, so to speak, his full-time occupation, you don't pray. Because when He's talking, you don't interrupt. More important for you to hear from Him than for Him to hear from you. So it comes out that if the temple is a conduit for prayer and for Talmud Torah, so then the temple is what supports this type of communication, the two-way communication. Then when you think about it, it's very natural. The temple's most important function was to house God's presence, the Shekhinah. V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti. So if God's presence is there, that enables the two-way interaction in a very vivid way. Now, the aficionados are going to say, hey, Rabbi, you left out the last word of that previous quote. And doesn't that sort of says, V'asuli mikdash, make for me a holy place, v'shachanti b'socham, I shall dwell among them. B'socholo ne'amar, doesn't say within it. It says b'socham, among them. Okay, that's what it means. So now you tell me, my friendly critic, does the Shekhinah not dwell in the temple? Is that what's you're being told? Doesn't say in it. Doesn't say in it. It says in them. So the Shekhinah is not in the temple? It surely is. All the literature says that it is. So what does the verse mean when it says, I'll dwell among them? It means the purpose of it is not that it should dwell in the temple or the tabernacle. The purpose is that it should dwell in the tabernacle so that it can dwell in the hearts of all the Jews. It's not that it's not going to be there. The question is, why is it there? Not a vacation home for the Shekhinah, chas v'sholom. By dwelling in the tabernacle, us surrounding the tabernacle, it'll come to dwell in our hearts. So that again, the dwelling of the Shekhinah in the tabernacle is the means by which it becomes part of us or associates itself with us and enables the two-way interaction. So the fact that prayer and the Torah are both associated with the existence of the temple means that carries the idea of the Shekhinah in the temple. That's what it was for. There are other things as well that it did. I just want to draw the practical conclusions from this much observation. Let's go back to the fact that in every prayer we ask the rebuilding the temple. Why do we do that? Part because prayer and sacrifices, prayer and the temple were supposed to go hand in hand. That's what the institution that the men of the Great Assembly at the beginning of the Second Temple accomplished. That there should be a coordination between prayer and sacrifices. So what's the idea? The idea is this: sacrifices. They're very important. Am I involved? Priests are in the temple, and they're bringing the sacrifices 365. Am I involved? Sure, I'm involved. Listen, every Adar, they take a half shekel. Psh, I paid my half shekel. So in July, When I sleep until noon, no problem. Because at 9 o'clock, the priests are offering the offering. And my name is there. It's on the card file. Because I paid my dues 3 months before, so I can sleep until noon. Rabbi said, no. No. That's not what we want. You have to participate in the joint institution called prayer sacrifice by offering prayers at the same time, so that it's an experienced national gesture, not just their representatives who carry it out in the temple. That's what they wanted to be done. Okay, now, we don't have that anymore. We only have the prayer. So the joint performance is fractured. What you have to feel when you pray is that I'm only doing half the job. You have to feel a tremendous inadequacy. When you pray for the temple being restored, it's not just because God wants it to be a temple, so our life is incomplete without it, but the very prayer that I'm uttering is fractured. And this is very beautifully brought out by a change in the vocabulary that the Shulchan Aruch changes from what's written in the Gemara. I told you, what's written in the Gemara is we'll make the sacrifice, the prayers corresponding to the sacrifices. Keneged. In the Shulchan Aruch it says bimkom, in place of. The very word I told you it doesn't say. Well, it says that in the Shulchan Aruch. What's the idea of it? I'll tell you what the idea of it is. You have a baseball team, and you're scheduled to play a game against another team, and you get together at the field, and only 7 of your members show up. They have all 9, and you have 7. Well, you could just forfeit the game. And you say, no, you know what? We'll do it. We'll play with 7, okay? We'll have 2 outfielders, and they'll rotate based on the batters, right-handed, left-handed, and we'll do it without a shortstop. We'll do it with 7. That means the 7 are playing the game in place of the 9. They're not giving up the game, but it's a team of 7 and not 9. That's what the Shulchan Aruch, I believe, means when he says that prayers today are in place of the sacrifices. It means there used to be prayer and sacrifices together, and together they made a whole that did a job, and now all we have left to do the whole job is half the means. So we're going to use the prayer to try to do the job with only half the means as best we can. But that's the way you have to feel about it. You have to feel that we're missing out on the performance because we're missing the other half of the means. And that's why we ask for the rebuilding of the temple when we pray. That's one thing. Now, let's take Talmud Torah. You probably have experienced this, and the deeper you get into Talmud Torah, the more often you will experience the frustration of not understanding. The attempt, especially if you have good chavrusas, attempt, which sometimes involves argument and discussion and debate and throwing bricks at each other, and sometimes involves cooperative effort, and sometimes you're successful, sometimes you aren't, and you want to understand. You want to understand because God wants you to understand. You also want to understand because you have an ego and you think you're intellectual and you have all sorts of selfish. You really want to understand and you don't get it. You don't get it. That's very frustrating. Why are you not getting it? One reason is because the temple isn't standing. That's why. Because the flow of Torah through the temple to the Jewish people has been interrupted. So when you suffer that frustration, you have to think, one of the reasons why I'm suffering that frustration is because the temple isn't standing. And when you pray for the temple to be restored, think about your frustrations in studying Torah and think, please, Ribbon Shalom, I want to understand your Torah better. And that's why it says at the end, when we pray for the rebuilding of the temple and restoration of the sacrifices, please give us our portion in Torah, because without that, the temple standing, we lack at least some of our portion in Torah. I'll tell you personally, I've been learning with Rabbi Gershenfeld for 42 years, and he studies the Maharal. He's always studied the Maharal, and he's quoting the Maharal to me all the time. From time to time, we studied the Maharal together. I just didn't get it. I did not get it. This is 40 years. That's not a short period of time. You know, it's probably double your age. About 6 months ago, I started to get it. I'm astonished at myself. Although I didn't give up trying, I didn't have much hope. My President Rebbitzin has studied the Maharal, a great deal of the Maharal. We've studied it together also. It's gotten to the point where I can very often say what he's going to say. At the end of a paragraph, I can say what the next paragraph will say. I'm in shock. I never thought I would get that kind of understanding. It was a long time in coming. 40 years is a long time. And the thrill of being able to understand. And now I say to myself, if the temple were standing, maybe it would have taken 8 years instead of 40. And all the other things that I still don't understand would have been more open to me. When you have a desire to understand the Torah and it's frustrated, this is one of the reasons why it's frustrated. I just mentioned one other thing to think about, and then this is just a program of things to think. The Talmud says that the temple was the key to certain successes in the physical world and certain beauties in the physical world. The taste of the fruits, rain, productivity of the crops. The temple had an effect on that also. So when there are losses and when there are shortcomings, maybe even a tiny thing. I don't know if you've heard of PB&J. Of course. He's a history major, so sure he's heard about that. Peanut butter and jelly. Every one of the 16 million American school children went to school with PB&J. There were no allergies. Nobody dropped dead. There were no peanut-free zones. Nothing like that. What happened? Well, some people have a ready answer. It's pollution and it's the environment and global warming and, the mantras that people had. Maybe they're right, who knows? But one thing's for sure, we are susceptible to terrible reactions from peanuts and peanut butter that we didn't used to be. The things that happen to us through the natural world, where the purity and beauty and inspiration that can come through the natural world is lacking, is also due to the fact that the temple isn't with us. So whenever you come across these kinds of failures in your spiritual environment and in the physical part of your spiritual environment, you have to think, one part of it is the fact that we don't have the temple. Trace it back to the temple. The Gemara says, I forget who it was Gamliel. There was a widow whose husband had died, and she used to cry at night in his area when he could hear her crying, and he would cry over the loss of the temple. Because the loss of the temple leads to political instability and susceptibility to pogroms and all the rest of that. And he felt that it was the loss of the temple that was responsible for the loss of her husband. It's a central motif in the various types of suffering that Jews undergo. It has to be generalized beyond the narrow context, especially for people for whom animal sacrifice is something they can't relate to at all. So then it becomes very strange. Crying over a place where would I vote for a restoration of the kind of sacrifice? I'm not sure, right? If they say that, so then it's very hard for them to be motivated to feel bad about it, to feel that there was a loss. The loss is much more widespread than that. Everybody can feel the loss of the profundity in response to prayer. Everybody can feel it with respect to the difficulty of learning Torah. And everybody has it to a great extent in the natural world. So this is the way in which, in practical terms, you could relate to the loss of the temple. Kodesh Baruch Hu should give us, in our sensitivity to what we've lost and our sincerity in seeking to have it restored, that it should be restored. Amen.